Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we're going to be covering everything to do with periodization of linear speed training. We're going to be covering everything from the annual plan all the way into the exact exercises, sets and reps of the training session. These principles can be applied both to the track and field events of linear running and also for athletes in field-based sports who need speed as a component of their physical preparation. So first we need to establish an annual plan in order to follow a basic guideline throughout the year. If we don't have an annual plan, we basically don't have a map to follow throughout the year, and it's going to be difficult to plan further from there. So just to reiterate, the annual plan doesn't dictate the exact training program, it just gives us a basic guideline to follow. So I've created an example annual plan here, just so we have some sort of guideline to follow for the rest of the video. So as we can see in this competitions row, there are 3 competitions in this section of the year, followed by 3 competitions in the latter section of the year. So this is completely made up, but it does give us an example to follow. So I've colored them darker and lighter based on the importance. So assuming that the darker the color, the more important the competition is. This could be a particular 100-meter race, a national championships or something like that. Or this could simply be just a point that we need to be at our best at for finals in some sort of team sport. It doesn't matter. The point is that the darker the color, the more of a peak we need to be at. So based on these competitions, we can split the year up into 2 basic phases. So we'll just name them phase 1 and phase 2. And then those phases can then be split up further into mesocycles or blocks. So this phase here has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 blocks, whereas this one has 5 blocks. So this is a slightly shorter phase. We then have these phases here, which are transitional phases, which is essentially the off season of the athlete, where they're not going to formally be training for their sport, or in this case, doing any speed training. They're probably going to be doing more cross training or some sort of unorganized physical preparation. Before moving into how we can progress and periodize our training, we first want to take a more detailed look at the weekly undulation of speed training. So we have 3 interconnected qualities of speed training which aren't distinct and they all blend into each other. So we have acceleration, maximum speed, and speed endurance. So acceleration is when we are going from a point of low or no speed and we are gaining speed. So essentially this would be the first 20 or so meters in a 100-meter race. Maximum speed is where we essentially focusing on increasing how absolutely fast we can run. So this would be that point in a 100-meter race from about 30 to 70 meters. And we then have speed endurance, which is the ability to sustain a high level or maximum level of speed. So this would be not quite as important in a 100-meter race as it would be in something like a 200-meter race. So these 3 qualities are all going to contribute to the performance of linear speed. We also have 3 interconnected training methods that we can use to improve sprinting performance. The first one is speed training. So that's the most important and the most specific method of training we can do, which is simply running fast in a straight line. We then have other training methods that can also help improve our speed. So we have power training and strength training. And these 2 qualities are again interconnected, but we have a few distinct qualities to separate them. So power training, for the sake of this video, is going to be any sort of ballistic type training focused on moving at a higher velocity, whereas strength training is going to be resistance training focused on the force qualities rather than the velocity qualities of the movement. So this here is an example of a training session that's focused on acceleration. So we're starting here with our speed components, and we first and foremost have a block start. So that's a specific start for a track and field sprint. So we're going to keep the distance of these runs lower in order to make sure we're focusing on that acceleration phase. And the effort we're going to put into these is maximal, as we should be doing almost all of the time with speed training. We then can have another speed exercise that's going to complement our block starts. So a sled pull, essentially a resisted running for the same distance and maximal effort. Then moving on to our power exercise, I just have 1 power and 1 strength exercise here for examples. You could potentially add more. A forward medicine ball throw, And that's going to tie in well with our acceleration emphasized training session, since this is going to be a horizontal power exercise which has similar force vectors to when we are accelerating. It also has a similar body position, a forward lean and a horizontal propulsion, with added resistance as the forces during acceleration are going to be higher with slower ground contact times. Again, we want to keep the volumes quite low and keep the effort maximal in order to make sure we're working with a specific maximal intent. For a strength exercise, we may have more than one, but I've put one as an example. And I've got here, along the same theme, a hip thrust, so a lower body strength exercise. This is again going to follow the same pattern of using horizontal force application in a hip thrust. And these sets and reps are obviously going to be periodized throughout the year, but just as a typical example session, 3 sets of 6. This here is another example of a speed training session, but this is going to be focused on maximum velocity. So again, we may have a block start or some sort of specific start, and we're going to do a maximal effort linear sprint, but this time the distance is going to be higher, 60 meters, to allow us to reach those top speeds. Then if we have access, we may do some sort of overspeed sprint in order to actually increase the velocity of our running even further. And again, with these sprints, the effort is going to be maximal, and we probably want to get that overspeed of only around 5 or 10%. In terms of a power exercise, this time we're moving away from resisted power, and we're going to do more of a reactive type power exercise, so some plyometrics, which is going to again tie in well with the theme of maximal velocity, because maximal velocity running is quite highly dependent on a rapid stretch shortening cycle. So drop jumps from around 30 centimeters, for an example, 3 sets of 5. And again, these are going to be periodized over the training year. For a strength exercise, we may do a back squat. Again, 3 sets of 6. And the reason I put back squat here is because it has a vertical force orientation rather than a horizontal, which is similar force vectors to what we see during upright maximal velocity running. And lastly, we have a speed endurance emphasized speed training session. And again, with our speed exercise, we're going to do some sort of start. Probably don't need to be that specific with the start in this session. So 4 sets of longer distances now, 120 meters, so slightly higher volumes and greater distances, and the effort is going to be slightly less because we are not going to be able to run 120 meters as fast as we can run a 80 to 100 meters. So the effort might be around 90% of our maximum speed and trying to maintain that the entire distance. For a power exercise, put in here bounds, so 4 sets of 10 for maximal distance. So essentially, again, we're getting that plyometric activity, but this time we're going for more reps and we're going for max distance. So we're trying to sustain that intense stretch shortening cycle activity and continue to rapidly produce force over a prolonged period. In terms of strength, we may simply do some upper body work or some accessory work, as we've already done 2 lower body strength sessions and it's probably enough throughout a training week. And with the strength sessions, we probably want to do slightly higher volumes of that as well to stay with the same theme. So if we put all those sessions into a weekly plan, it may look something like this. So day 1 may be our acceleration focus day, day 2 may be our speed endurance focus day, and day 3 may be our maximum speed focus day. That way we are undulating the emphasis throughout the week and undulating the volumes and naturally undulating the intensities via the different qualities that we're emphasizing on each day. So now that we've established the weekly structure of our speed training, we need to now put this into a mesocycle and add progressive overload. The initial weekly structure that we had previously planned, I've now put that into a 4-week mesocycle. So starting with day 1, the acceleration focus day, we can progress that over the 4 weeks in order to create specific adaptation to the goal of increasing linear speed. So with our first exercise, the block start, we're simply going to keep the sets the same and the effort the same and simply add distance to the reps that we do over the 3 weeks. The 4th week here is a deload, so this is going to be where we reduce the volume so that the body has time to recover and adapt from the previous 3 weeks of overloading training. The same idea is in place with the sled pull. We're just going to increase the distance in order to get more specific to the task we're aiming to achieve. For a power exercise, our forward medicine ball throw, we're simply going to increase the reps that we do as a form of progressive overload while keeping the sets and the intensity constant. Again, in the deload week, the volume goes down to allow recovery and adaptation. Finally, a hip thrust. In this example here, with our strength training, we may simply just keep the reps and sets the same and aim to increase load slightly each week and then deload in the fourth week. Moving on to day 2, this is our speed endurance day. And we're going to do a similar thing here with our rolling starts. So we're going to keep the sets the same and simply increase the distance in order to try and increase our capacity while maintaining our intensity. So if we're able to maintain this speed and go for prolonged distance, our speed endurance is likely going to improve. For the bounds, we may do the same thing. We may go for maximum distance and prolong the efforts we are producing in an attempt to maintain that high intensity for prolonged periods. With our upper body strength work, rather than increasing the load, we may focus on increasing the reps since it's a speed endurance day and the volume is generally going up on this day. Again, in the fourth week in our deload, we're going to reduce the volume while maintaining the intensity. On our final maximum speed day, we're going to do basically exactly the same progressions, increase the distance in order to become more specific and probably be able to hit greater top speeds. Same thing with our overspeed sprints. Now with the power exercise, the drop jump, in order to get more specific and more intense, we may decrease the reps going forward while increasing the intensity by increasing the height of the drop. This is therefore going to stress the stretch shortening cycle qualities even more and hopefully improve those. With our strength exercise, we may simply do the same as when we had our acceleration day, maintain the reps and sets and just focus on increasing the load slightly. The last thing that we're going to go through is how we might change the program depending on where we are in the year. So if we are really far away from where we need a peak, or if we are right before we need a peak, how is that going to alter our training program? I've now taken that same weekly training session and applied it to 3 different situations throughout the training year. The first one is an example session of when we are quite far away from when we need a peak. This one is an example of a training week that's going to be a bit closer to where we need a peak. And this is an example of a training week immediately before or during a time that we need to be at our peak. So the general progression here is that the further away we are from our peak, the more general and less specific we're going to be with our training. So starting with our acceleration focus day, we may still do our starts, but we may do them when we're further away from our peak on grass. This is going to reduce the stress on the joints and also not allow us to run quite as fast. This could then be progressed as we get closer to our peak from using the track and then increasing the distance further to when we are right at our peak on the track using specific starts. With our sled pull, we may start with lower distances and heavier weight, followed by moderate distance and moderate weight, and then finally progressing to lighter loads and increasing the distance more, therefore being more specific to the exact event. With our power exercise, we may use the original forward medicine ball throw that we had with a heavy weight for more reps. When we get a little bit closer to our peak, we may use the same exercise and just decrease the load that we're using and decrease the reps in order to increase the velocity. And then finally, we may change the exercise to something like a single leg broad jump when we're at our peak for fewer reps. This is simply just going to be a more specific exercise, and it's also going to be unilateral, which is more specific to acceleration and running in general, and decreasing the reps again in order to make sure we're performing these at maximal velocity and intensity. With our strength exercises, a simple linear periodization model should work well for speed training, so starting with higher reps and therefore slightly lower loads, decreasing the reps and increasing the loads throughout the training year, where we're hitting the heaviest loads during our peak. In terms of the speed endurance day, we may simply use the rolling starts again on grass, followed by rolling starts on the track, and then rolling starts on the track again. And what we're doing here is we're simply increasing the distance while maintaining the loads throughout the training year. With our bounds, these are quite a specific exercise already, so we may keep the same exercise the entire time and simply increase the amount of reps we're doing, and once again trying to prolong the amount of distance we can do while maintaining a high power output. For our upper body strength work, we may simply do again a linear periodization where we decrease the repetitions and subsequently increase the loads throughout the year. Finally, for our maximum speed day, we may use our block starts or maybe a non-specific start. We might do that on the grass and then progress to the track. And we are simply again just going to increase the distance until we're getting more and more specific at the point that we need to peak. Same idea with our overspeed sprinting. We may start with lower distances and increase the distances to become more specific. With our drop jumps, we may increase the height of the drop throughout the training year while decreasing the repetitions. And then when we get even closer to our peak, we may swap the exercise to something more specific that's going to involve continuous stretch shortening cycle requirements or some sort of unilateral exercise. An exercise like repeated hurdle jumps should work well because they involve that cyclical motion of the legs and involves repeated stretch shortening cycle activity. And we may actually increase the amount of reps we're doing during this exercise since maximum velocity running requires more than 3 steps. And once again with our strength exercises, we may simply do a linear periodization where we're starting with higher reps and lower intensities and progressing the intensities until we're at our peak, hitting our heaviest loads. With this strength exercise, we may also get more specific with our range of motion. So we may do full depth back squats followed by half squats and then quarter squats. Since our legs don't really work in deep squats during sprinting, they only work in a shallow range of motion. Thanks for watching and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.